Hi, I'm Liza Nash Taylor, and I'm going to read for you today for Bad Mouth. So, I have two historical novels that have come out recently. The first one is called Etiquette for Runaways from Blackstone Publishing. It came out August 2020. It's set in 1924 and 25, and it starts out here in the house where I'm sitting, and then it moves on to Prohibition era New York and Jazz Age Paris. The second one is also set in this house, Keswick Farm. It's called In All Good Faith. This is the advanced reader copy. The hardcover will come out August 10th, again from Blackstone. So I thought I would read from In All Good Faith today. It's my first reading from the book. And there are two main characters. It's a dual narrative. And the first character, Mae Marshall, from my first book, also appears in All Good Faith. But there's another main character who's a 16-year-old girl from Boston. And I'm going to read from her very first chapter in the book. And she's 16. Boston, Massachusetts, December 16th, 1931. God, what is wrong with me? Sometimes it was an invisible feather, a wisp skimming the back of her neck. Sometimes it was a spindle winding tight inside her chest until she breathed like a cornered rabbit. And sometimes, the worst times, fear was a thing with teeth and claws. It rode on streetcars and hid in movie theaters. It came to church and sat down beside her. On a Wednesday night in December, Dorrit Sykes was the cornered rabbit. She sat stiffly on a tufted velveteen cushion in a church pew in the annex of the Mother Church of Christ Scientists. Around her, Christian Science parishioners sat attentively, focused forward toward the altar. She breathed shallowly, silently reciting, Our Father. It was a familiar litany, though she found no comfort in the familiarity. She knew as a practical person that her fear was unfounded. She was doing something utterly normal. Wednesday night is for church, she told herself. Church is a safe place. Who art in heaven. 12 long rows of pews between herself and the exit. How many people? Maybe 100, maybe staring, maybe whispering to each other? That poor Sykes family. Maybe the others saw that she felt trapped, that her thoughts were not on the service at all, but were instead jumping erratically with imagined disaster, her mind whirling with memories she could not block. Around her, women fanned themselves with folded service programs. The church was overheated. Dorrit had signed up for nursery duty, as she often did, as an avoidance of sitting through the services. When she arrived, there had been only one baby and a volunteer already there, that horrid, bossy Mrs. Fleming, Dorrit secretly called her. When a woman arrived with the second infant, Mrs. Fleming had reached for it, cooing in baby talk that she would manage just fine alone, that Dorrit should go to the service. Then, patting the arm of the exhausted-looking new mother, Mrs. Fleming said, with a glance toward Dorrit, You know, Cecilia, my own childbirths, all 4, were truly divine transitions. She held up one index finger, her voice lilting. One must free the mind of the illusion of pain. One must purify the thoughts. After my last, I got right up to make supper, pot roast with pearl onions. Dorrit thought of flinging then, but the young mother had said, Are you by yourself? I'll walk with you. So, thus banished from the nursery, Dorrit had arrived just before the service started and had no choice but to take a seat in the second row. At least the other parishioners slid down to make room at the end of the pew. She wouldn't be trapped in the center. Small mercies. Dorrit squeezed her eyes closed as a flush of heat spread over her cheeks and forehead. She hated those deep red stains, always so vivid against her usual pallor. Silently ordering herself to breathe, she opened her eyes and began her series of distractions, visually tracing the intricate stenciled designs bordering the walls, the burnished golds and reds and mossy greens in a pattern reminiscent of an oriental carpet. She devised names for the wall color, which was pinkish and brownish, yet neither pink nor brown. She counted the tall pipes of the organ until they ran together, then studied the stained glass windows, the closest being a beatific Madonna swathed in cobalt blue, surrounded by pearly glass clouds. From the pulpit, ebullient parishioners delivered awed, grateful testimonies of healing. But she wasn't listening. Hallowed be thy name. Dorrit had been raised in Boston and brought up to believe that pain and illness were illusions, as Christian Science founder Mary Baker Eddy proclaimed, and parishioners like Mrs. Fleming espoused, signaling a defect in the spirit. When she had listened on other Wednesday nights, from the safety of the back row, Dorrit experienced no inspiration, no reinforcement of faith. Instead, she was left with a resigned, disjointed sort of guilt, a feeling of failure that she herself had no testimony of healing to offer. Had she been passed over for someone more deserving? Sometimes she could not help but wonder, if her nervous spells were miraculously cured, would that mean that someone else, someone with a worse affliction, might never be healed? Were healings some sort of holy ticket, with only so many issued? Were she and her family marked somehow as unworthy or undeserving, or worse, lacking in faith? Second by second, minute by long minute, she willed herself to stay where she was. During the singing, she stood, dutifully mouthing lyrics she knew by heart, while discreetly inhaling the comforting mustiness of old paper and the leather binding of the hymnal, all the while wishing it were a Nancy Drew mystery instead, and she was safe at home. During prayers, she pressed her palms together and studied the tail of her long, pale brown braid, then counted the tiny mosaic tiles on the floor, tapping her feet with silent agitation. The stitching on one sole of her scuffed brown shoes had worn away, so that if she wiggled her toes just so, the split gaped like a fish's mouth. Nancy Drew doesn't have holes in her shoes. She wears shined saddle Oxfords. She probably has them in brown and white and black and white. New shoes cost $2.98. Nancy Drew never has nerves. They were the same age, she and Nancy, 16, and yet Nancy had her own automobile and two best friends. She traveled to exciting places and had adventures. Nancy Drew was fearless. Our Father, Dorrit recited again in a tiny whisper, who art in heaven. But it was starting. First, a heightened awareness of her skin. Less than an itch, more than a tingle. Every inch of skin on her body all at once, heavy with dread. Then the skittering thoughts. Her hands turned cold and seemed to disconnect from her body. Then the pressure inside her rib cage, the squeezing, that feeling at the top of her throat, a drawstring pulling taut. Hallowed be thy name. Her eyes flickered from the altar to the side exit. The Church of Christ Scientists had no proper minister. Services were led, as Mrs. Eddy decreed, by Jesus Christ and conducted by its members. So as the testimonies continued, with one parishioner finishing a story of walking miles on an ankle he had sprained the previous day, another testifier took his place. The woman described the miraculous healing through prayer of a bunion on her left foot. When Dorrit had asked her mother about pain, she was told to have faith, to pray that her thoughts would be changed, that her mind would cease to corrupt her body with weakness. But faith was hard. Faith had not saved her mother. When the service concluded, Dorrit sprang from her seat, her mouth dry, her back damp with perspiration. Outside, parishioners set off into the December night in pairs or family groups, fathers wrapping necks in mufflers, mothers stooping to adjust a child's mitten. She hurried alone through the church plaza, away from the tall granite columns and the 126-foot dome and spire of the mother church. At the edge of the long, reflecting pond, a pair of men in threadbare overcoats stood beneath a streetlight, bindles and bedrolls on the pavement beside them. One tipped his hat to Dorrit, and she looked away, unable to accept his civility. If she gave him the change in her pocket, she would have to walk home, and all she wanted was to be home. And there it was again. Guilt. So many people in this city, hungry, without jobs or homes, sleeping on pavement in the winter wind. She turned back, but the men were walking away. The skyline of Boston loomed gray, dotted with yellow-white windows, the air heavy with the promise of more snow. On Huntington Avenue, Dorrit waited for the Chestnut Hill trolley line. The spell was not over, but it was waning. Streetcar, bus, walk 2 blocks, 3 flights of stairs. A loud scraping noise caused her to turn. A weary-looking nag pulled a wide snowplow down the center of the street, led by a man with his head wrapped in a woolen muffler. Some entrepreneurial spirit had set up a line of fir trees on the sidewalk with a brazier for warmth. The hand-lettered sign read, "Merry Christmas, fresh trees." The Sykes would not have a tree. They never had. A long church service would be followed by a quiet Christmas day at home, intended to be spent in reflection. At Copley Square, Dorrit changed to the bus, then walked the last blocks. Ahead, under a street light, she could see the darkened hulk of the Winchell School, and across the street, her own stoop, 23 Blossom Street in the West End of Boston. Home. Safety. Inside, 2 shivering little boys sat side by side on the bottom step, hands clasped between their knees. They were dressed identically in patched woolen knickers and frayed overcoats. Both had black hair and green eyes. "Colin, Fred," Dorrit said, "what are you doing down here? It's nearly 8:30. Fred, 5, wiped his eyes. Colin Sullivan, 2 years older, said, "Quit your blubbering, Fred." To Dorrit he said, through chattering teeth, "The baby lady's here. Dad's sent us out. Ma's hollering, and now Fred's hungry." Dorrit drew in a sharp breath. "The baby lady?" "Ma sent Dad to fetch her," Colin said. "We didn't get any supper." Dorrit took their cold, bare hands. "Well, come up with me. Let's see if we can get you warmed up." Colin and Fred lived on the second-floor rear with their parents. Dorrit earned a nickel a day watching the boys after she got home from school, while their mother worked late shift in a laundry. On the second-floor landing, Dorrit paused, listening. From down the hall she heard raised voices. "Wait here." She knocked lightly on Sullivan's door. Her breath steamed in the unheated hallway. There was shuffling, then the door opened. The boy's father squinted at Dorrit. She said, "I'll keep them upstairs. Hope it all goes well." Sullivan nodded once, blowing out a long breath. "Much obliged." Dorrit unlocked the door of the Sykes' apartment on the 3rd-floor front. The boys stood in the doorway. "Come on, then," she said. "Let's get you warm, and then we'll have a story." Crossing the linoleum floor, she switched on gas lights, saying brightly, "The snow's held off. I could have hung the wash outside after all." Tied from gas jet to gas jet, a wash line crossed the small kitchen, hung with union suits and trousers, and her own narrow dresses. The air was redolent with white wizard soap flakes. Wednesday. Wash day. Dorrit would not allow herself to imagine what might be happening in the apartment below. She wiped the boys' faces and hands and set them together on the parlor sofa, wrapped in a quilt. She gave each of them a slice of buttered bread and a glass of hot milk. The supper plates she'd left for her father and brother were still in the cold oven, congealing beans and slices of fatty ham. Wednesday. beans, and ham. The Sykes apartment consisted of 4 rooms. Beyond the kitchen were 2 small connected bedrooms. The first she shared with her older brother. The second was her father's. In the parlor, 2 front windows looked down onto Blossom Street and offered a sliver view of the Charles River. On the sill, 3 red geraniums bloomed in a wooden cheese box. From the gray sidewalk below, muffled calls of newsboys hawking their last copies of late editions floated in, along with the odors of rubbish and low tide that tenaciously seeped through newspaper-chinked window frames to permeate brick and clapboard. Automobiles and carts rumbled past, clattering against the block paving of the street, splashing through puddles of slush. The rattle of a window pane startled Fred, who had nodded off, his head held up by a small fist that still clutched a bread crust. Dorrit took up the boy's cups, saying, "Listen to that wind. How about a little lie down and a story? Just till your dad comes for you." Colin nodded, smiling. "Fred, wake up. I want to hear the rest of the story about the hidden treasure." And, well, that's it. Thank you for having me to badmouth